It's 3 in the morning, and the world's most prestigious hunter academy is completely silent. Every student is fast asleep in their dorms, dreaming about the day they'll finally awaken their powers and become real hunters. But in room 207, something impossible is happening. A young boy sits cross-legged on his bed, and surrounding him is an aura so dense, so powerful, that it's causing the air itself to shimmer like a mirage in the desert. If anyone could see this energy, they'd recognize it immediately as the signature of an SSS-Rank hunter. The kind of power that takes decades to achieve. The kind of power that only a handful of people in the entire world possess. But here's the thing that would truly shock them. This boy isn't even trying. This is just his resting state. His baseline. And if they knew the truth about who he really was, about what he'd been doing since before he could even walk, they'd realize that everything they thought they knew about hunters, about power, about what's possible, was about to be completely shattered. Let me take you back. Way back. To a night 16 years ago when the world was still figuring out what dungeons even were. The phenomenon had only started 5 years prior. These mysterious rifts appearing out of nowhere, connecting our world to dimensions filled with monsters and magic. Most people were still terrified. Governments were scrambling to create systems, to train people who could fight back. The concept of hunters was brand new, and everyone was still trying to understand the rules. On this particular night, in a small clinic on the outskirts of Seoul, a woman was in labor. Nothing about this seemed special. She wasn't from a famous hunter family. Her husband wasn't some legendary warrior. They were just ordinary people caught up in extraordinary times. But the moment that baby entered the world, something happened that the doctors couldn't explain. Every light in the building flickered. Every piece of electronic equipment went haywire for exactly 3 seconds. And in that brief moment, experienced hunters across the entire city felt something. A pulse of energy so pure and concentrated that it made their skin prickle. The hospital staff wrote it off as a power surge. The nearby hunters assumed it was some kind of dungeon anomaly. No one connected it to the tiny infant now crying in his mother's arms. Why would they? Babies don't have power. The earliest anyone had ever awakened was 13 years old, and that kid had made international news. But here's what no one knew, what no one could have possibly guessed. That baby, that tiny, helpless-looking infant, was already awakened. Not partially. Not in some latent way that would manifest later. Fully awakened. And not just awakened, but awakened at a level that would make veteran S-Rank hunters look like children playing with toy swords. His parents named him Jiho. And for the first few months, everything seemed normal. He cried when he was hungry. He slept when he was tired. He did all the things babies do. But his mother noticed something odd. When Jiho cried, things around him would occasionally move. Not dramatically, just little things. A toy sliding across the floor. A blanket rippling as if caught by wind in a closed room. She mentioned it to her husband once, laughing it off as her imagination. New mothers are always exhausted, she told herself, always seeing things that aren't there. But then came the incident that changed everything. Jiho was 6 months old. His father was holding him, walking around the living room trying to get him to sleep. And suddenly, without any warning, the entire apartment building started shaking. It wasn't an earthquake. It was something worse. A dungeon gate had opened, right there in their neighborhood. Right there, less than 100 meters from their building. And from that gate poured out creatures that humanity was still learning to classify. Gray-skinned monsters with claws like razors and eyes that glowed with malevolent intelligence. Orcs, the awakened community would later call them. C-rank threats, dangerous enough to kill untrained civilians, but manageable for competent hunters. Except there were no hunters nearby. This was a residential area. The nearest Hunter Association office was 15 minutes away, and in 15 minutes, these monsters could slaughter hundreds of people. Jiho's father did what any parent would do. He grabbed his wife, grabbed his baby, and ran for the nearest safe room in the building's basement. Other families were doing the same. Thundering down the stairs, children crying, adults shouting. The building management had installed these safe rooms after the dungeon phenomenon started. Reinforced concrete chambers that could theoretically hold off monsters long enough for hunters to arrive. They almost made it. Jiho's family was steps away from the safe room door when one of the orcs appeared at the end of the hallway. It was massive, easily over 2 meters tall, with shoulders broader than any human and muscles that looked like they'd been carved from stone. It saw them, and it charged. Jiho's mother screamed. His father pushed them behind him, putting his own body between the monster and his family, knowing it was useless but doing it anyway because what else could he do? And that's when baby Jiho, barely old enough to sit up on his own, opened his eyes. They weren't the normal brown they'd been since birth. They were glowing. Bright silver like molten metal, like stars had replaced his pupils. His tiny hand raised, pointing at the charging orc. And from that hand erupted a beam of pure energy, so concentrated and powerful that it didn't just kill the monster. It erased it. Completely. Utterly. There wasn't even ash left behind. Just a scorch mark on the wall where the orc had been, and a smell like ozone after a lightning strike. The hallway went silent. Jiho's parents stared at their baby, their 6-month-old infant, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Other families who'd seen it were frozen, mouths open, unable to even form words. And then Jiho's eyes returned to normal, and he started crying again. Just a normal baby cry, like nothing impossible had just happened. The Hunter Association arrived 7 minutes later. They found a neighborhood in chaos, multiple casualties, but also something they couldn't explain. Several dead orcs with wounds that didn't match any known monster or weapon. Burns so precise and powerful that their forensics team couldn't identify the source. They questioned everyone. Jiho's father, still in shock, told them the truth. Told them what his baby had done. And the hunters did what anyone would do when faced with something that doesn't fit their understanding of reality. They didn't believe him. Babies can't use magic. Babies can't have awakened powers. The man was clearly traumatized, making things up, his mind trying to process the horror of what he'd witnessed. But one hunter, a woman named Yuna, who specialized in energy detection, asked to see the baby. Jiho's parents, still reeling, agreed. And the moment Yuna got close enough, the moment she activated her appraisal skill, her face went pale. Her hands started shaking. She looked at Jiho's parents and said 3 words that would change their lives forever. He's fully awakened. Not partially. Not latent potential that would manifest later. Fully awakened. And not just awakened at some basic level. The amount of energy she was detecting was off her charts. Literally. Her appraisal skill, which could accurately measure power up to A rank, couldn't even properly quantify what Jiho possessed. It was like trying to measure the ocean with a teaspoon. She could tell it was vast, could tell it was more powerful than anything she'd ever encountered, but she couldn't tell exactly how powerful. Yuna pulled Jiho's parents aside. She explained the situation carefully. What Jiho possessed wasn't just rare, it was unprecedented. If word got out, if the wrong people learned about this, their son would never have a normal life. He'd be taken, studied, either by the government or by powerful hunter families or by organizations that didn't even officially exist. He'd become a weapon, a tool, never just a child. The only way to protect him was to keep it absolutely secret. Tell no one. Not family, not friends, certainly not any official agencies. Jiho's parents agreed immediately. But that left them with a massive problem. How do you raise a child with godlike power? How do you teach a baby not to accidentally obliterate things when he gets upset? Normal parenting books don't cover this. There's no manual for dealing with an infant who can level buildings, Yuna offered to help. She'd been a teacher at one of the hunter academies before an injury forced her into administrative work. She knew techniques for power control, meditation methods that could help even the most volatile awakened individuals learn to manage their abilities. But teaching those techniques to a baby seemed impossible. Except it wasn't. Because Jiho wasn't really a baby, not mentally. He couldn't speak yet, couldn't walk yet. But his mind was somehow older than his body. He understood things that no infant should understand. The training started when Jiho was 8 months old. Yuna would come over 3 times a week, always careful, always making sure no one saw or suspected anything unusual. She'd sit with Jiho, talking to him like he was an adult, explaining concepts of energy control and meditation. His parents thought she was crazy at first, but then they saw results. Jiho stopped accidentally moving things when he cried, stopped causing lights to flicker when he got excited. He was learning. Actually learning. At an age when most babies were just figuring out object permanence, Jiho was mastering techniques that took adult hunters years to perfect. By his first birthday, Jiho could walk and had started saying simple words. He looked like a normal toddler, if perhaps a bit more coordinated than usual. But in secret, in the basement of his family's new house, a larger place with a reinforced training room that Yuna had helped them construct, Jiho was doing things that would make professional hunters weep with envy. He could create barriers strong enough to deflect bullets. He could manipulate energy so precisely that he could cut a playing card in half from across the room. He could sense energy sources from hundreds of meters away. And then Yuna brought up dungeons. Real dungeons, not the training simulations that hunter academies used. She knew of some low-level gates that appeared in remote areas, E-rank and D-rank dungeons that were barely worth official attention. Maybe, she suggested carefully, it would be good for Jiho to experience actual combat, actual monsters in a controlled environment. His parents were horrified at first. He was barely 1 year old. But Yuna made a compelling argument. Jiho's power was growing. They could all feel it. And power without practical experience was dangerous. Better to let him learn now, in weak dungeons where the monsters couldn't really hurt him, than to risk him losing control later when the stakes were higher. His first dungeon dive happened 2 weeks after his first birthday. They told no one. Yuna scouted a gate that had appeared in a forest 40 kilometers outside Seoul. E-rank, standard goblin dungeon. The kind that newly awakened hunters used for their first real combat experience. They went at night, Yuna carrying what looked like a sleeping toddler in her arms. His parents stayed outside, terrified, praying this wasn't a horrible mistake. Inside the dungeon, Jiho's eyes snapped open. He looked around, taking in the cave environment, the distant sounds of goblin chatter, the smell of damp stone and something rotten. Yuna set him down carefully, ready to grab him at the first sign of danger. And then Jiho started walking deeper into the dungeon, not stumbling like a toddler, walking with purpose, with awareness, like he knew exactly where he was going. The first goblin they encountered never even saw what killed it. Jiho glanced at it, extended his hand, and the creature just collapsed, its life force completely drained in an instant. The second one tried to attack, raising a crude spear. Jiho dodged, a movement far too fluid for someone who'd only been walking for a month, and touched the goblin's chest. It froze solid, ice crystallizing so fast that the creature didn't even have time to scream. 3 more goblins came around a corner. Jiho dealt with all of them simultaneously. 3 different types of magic, executed so perfectly that even Yuna, who'd been teaching him, couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. They found the boss room. A slightly larger goblin, maybe F-rank on its own, sitting on a crude throne of bones. It saw them enter and charged, screaming a war cry that echoed off the cave walls. Jiho raised both hands, and for the first time, Yuna saw what Jiho could really do when he tried. The goblin boss didn't just die, it was hit by multiple spells simultaneously. Fire, ice, lightning, force magic. All perfectly controlled, all devastating. The goblin literally came apart under the assault. When the spells ended, there was nothing left but a magic stone floating where the creature had been. The whole dungeon clear took 11 minutes. E-rank dungeons typically took teams of 5 awakened hunters between 30 and 45 minutes to clear safely. Jiho had done it alone, as a 1-year-old, in less time than it took most people to shower. Yuna stood there, holding a toddler who was yawning sleepily, who just single-handedly cleared a dungeon that would have challenged professional hunters. And she realized something terrifying. This wasn't even close to Jiho's limit. He hadn't struggled, hadn't been challenged. He'd been playing. They made it a regular thing after that. Once a month, sometimes twice, Yuna would take Jiho to remote dungeons. They started with E rank and quickly moved up. D rank. C rank. By the time Jiho was 2 years old, he was clearing B rank dungeons without breaking a sweat. And he was learning. Not just getting stronger, but understanding combat, strategy, how different monsters behaved. Goblins were cowardly but smart. Orcs were aggressive but predictable. Undead were relentless but vulnerable to specific types of magic. Jiho absorbed all of it, his mind cataloging information like a computer. His parents watched their son grow up living 2 completely different lives. During the day, Jiho was a normal little boy. He went to a regular preschool when he turned 3. He played with other kids. He learned his letters and numbers, though his teachers always commented on how advanced he seemed. At night and on weekends, he was something else entirely. A warrior, a mage, someone who could casually defeat monsters that killed experienced hunters. The hardest part wasn't the training or the dungeons, it was the hiding. Jiho had to constantly pretend to be weaker than he was. Had to act like a normal kid when every instinct told him he could do so much more. There were close calls. Once, during a field trip, a gate opened near the preschool. Hunters arrived quickly, but before they could evacuate all the children, a few orcs broke through. Jiho watched one charging at his classmate, a girl named Mina who was crying and frozen with fear. Every fiber of his being wanted to react, wanted to save her, but he couldn't, not without revealing what he was. He had to watch, had to wait, had to trust that the hunters would arrive in time. They did, barely, and Mina was okay. But that night, Jiho cried, not from fear, from frustration, from the weight of having so much power and not being able to use it to help people. Yuna saw what this was doing to him, so she adjusted their training, started taking him to dungeons where people were actually in danger. They'd monitor Hunter Association communications, listen for reports of dungeons that were proving difficult, situations where hunters were struggling or casualties were likely, and they'd show up. Yuna would go in officially, as a retired hunter offering assistance, and Jiho would come as her nephew or grandson, some random kid she was looking after. The hunters would protest at first, concerned about a child being in a dungeon, but Yuna would insist, promise to keep him safe. And then, when things got dangerous, when hunters were about to die, Jiho would act. He'd pretend to panic, to accidentally release magic and fear. The hunters would see a burst of energy from the scared kid, see monsters suddenly fall, and they'd chalk it up to luck or some kind of panic awakening. They never realized that the 5-year-old child had just saved their lives, that the terrified-looking boy had killed an A-rank boss monster while making it look like an accident. By age 6, Jiho had cleared more dungeons than most professional hunters cleared in their entire careers. He'd faced every common monster type and dozens of rare ones. He'd seen every standard dungeon environment and several unique ones. He'd accumulated more combat experience than some S-rank hunters, and he'd done all of it in complete secret. The Hunter Association had no idea he existed as an awakened individual. His name wasn't in any database. He was a ghost, A myth that didn't even have the courtesy of being recognized as a myth. His parents sometimes wondered if they'd made the right choice, letting their young child fight monsters, risk his life in dungeons, all while hiding who he really was. But Jiho never complained, never asked why he couldn't just be normal. He understood something that even many adult hunters didn't fully grasp. Power came with responsibility, and his power was so vast that the responsibility was proportionally enormous. If he revealed himself too early, before he fully understood what he could do, before he could control every aspect of his abilities, the consequences could be catastrophic. School became both easier and harder as he got older. Easier because the academic work was trivial. Jiho could read college-level texts at age 7, could understand complex mathematics and physics that wouldn't be taught until high school. Harder because he had to constantly dumb himself down, had to pretend to struggle with things that were absurdly simple, had to watch other kids receive praise for accomplishments that he could have done in his sleep. The social aspect was complicated too. He had friends, kids he genuinely liked. But there was always a distance, always a part of himself he could never share. The dungeon diving continued. By age 8, Jiho was regularly clearing A-rank dungeons, the kind that required full teams of experienced hunters and careful planning. He'd started developing his own combat style, a flowing mixture of close combat and magic that didn't fit into any of the standard hunter classifications. The association typically divided hunters into categories: fighters, who specialized in physical combat; mages, who used magic at range; tanks, who focused on defense; healers, who supported teams; assassins, who struck from stealth. But Jiho was all of them, and none of them. He'd created something new, something that only worked because his power level was so absurdly high. Yuna started bringing textbooks from hunter academies, official curriculum that wouldn't be taught until students were teenagers, theory about mana manipulation, advanced combat techniques, monster biology and weaknesses, dungeon formation patterns, all of it designed for students who'd been awakened for years and had basic control over their abilities. Jiho absorbed it all in weeks. He'd read a chapter on advanced barrier techniques, and the next time they went to a dungeon, he'd have already figured out how to implement what he'd read and improved on it. There were moments that scared even Yuna. Once they entered an A-rank dungeon that was supposed to be a standard ogre cave, but the intelligence was wrong. It wasn't standard. It was a variant dungeon, one of those rare occurrences where the normal monster types were replaced with something more dangerous. Instead of ogres, they found drakes. Young dragons, each one capable of breathing fire hot enough to melt steel. There were 7 of them. Yuna's first instinct was to retreat, to get Jiho out before something went wrong. But before she could even voice that thought, Jiho had already moved. 7 drakes. 7 different types of magic. Ice spears for the first drake, aimed perfectly at the soft spot under its jaw. Wind blades for the second, slicing through wings and leaving it grounded. Lightning for the third, conducted through its metallic scales until it seized up. He moved through them like a choreographed dance, each movement precise, each spell cast with perfect timing. The entire fight lasted maybe 20 seconds. When it was over, 7 drake corpses lay scattered around the cavern, and Jiho was standing in the middle, not even breathing hard, his eyes still glowing with that silver light they always had when he was actively using his power. Yuna realized something in that moment. She'd been teaching Jiho how to control his power, how to hide it, how to use it safely. But she'd never actually pushed him, never really tested his limits, because she was afraid of what she'd find. Afraid of discovering that this 9-year-old child was already stronger than any hunter alive, and even more afraid that he was still growing, still getting stronger, with no sign of slowing down. They started entering S-rank dungeons when Jiho turned 10. Real S-rank dungeons, not the kind that were on the edge of classification, but genuine top-tier threats. The kind that required full teams of S-rank hunters, careful coordination, sometimes multiple attempts. The kind where even experienced hunters sometimes didn't come back out. They had to be even more careful about these. S-rank dungeons were valuable. The Hunter Association monitored them closely. They couldn't just show up and clear one without raising questions, so they changed tactics. They'd wait for official teams to enter. Would time their own entry to arrive right when the hunters were struggling, when they'd fought deep enough that they were exhausted and low on resources. Yuna would suddenly appear, claiming she'd been training in the area and sensed something wrong, bringing young Jiho with her because she couldn't leave him alone. The hunters would be furious at first, outraged that someone had brought a child into an S-rank dungeon. And then things would get desperate. The dungeon boss would appear, or a trap would trigger, or something would go wrong. The hunters would be on the verge of death, and Jiho would have to make a choice. Let them die to protect his secret, or reveal just enough of his power to save them. He always chose to save them. But he was clever about it. He never showed his full strength. Never let on that he could have cleared the entire dungeon alone. He'd cast a spell that seemed desperate, panicked, that just happened to hit a weak point. Or he'd release a burst of energy that looked like a fear response but somehow saved everyone. The hunters would credit luck. Divine intervention. Anything but the truth, which was that a 10-year-old had just saved their lives. The magic stones from these dungeons were a problem. Valuable items that dropped from boss monsters couldn't just disappear. So they had a system. Yuna would take the most valuable stones and sell them through black market contacts, people who didn't ask questions about where items came from. The money went into a secret fund for Jiho's future. By his 11th birthday, he'd accumulated enough wealth to buy a small mansion. Not that his parents knew. Not that anyone knew. School became almost unbearable. Jiho was in 6th grade, learning multiplication tables and basic history, while in his free time he was clearing dungeons that professional teams struggled with. The disconnect was massive. His teachers thought he was a quiet, somewhat antisocial kid who didn't engage much. His classmates thought he was weird, always spacing out, never interested in the things they were interested in. No one suspected that when he zoned out during math class, he was mentally reviewing a near-death experience he'd had in an S-rank dungeon the previous weekend. There was one person at school who seemed to see through him, though. Her name was Sarah. She'd transferred to their school mid-year, a girl with silver hair and eyes that seemed too knowing for someone their age. She sat next to Jiho in class, and from day one, she paid attention to him in a way that made him nervous. Not suspicious attention, just curious, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. They became friends gradually. Sarah was the only person at school Jiho felt comfortable around. She never asked why he was so distant or weird. She just accepted him. They'd eat lunch together, sit together in class, and slowly, carefully, Jiho let his guard down around her. Not completely. He could never tell her the truth, but more than he had with anyone else. What he didn't know was that Sarah wasn't normal either. She came from one of the major hunter families, a prestigious bloodline that had produced multiple S-rank hunters over generations. She was awakened, had been since age 13, which was still remarkably young. Her family had sent her to a normal school specifically to learn how to interact with regular people, to not lose touch with what life was like for non-hunters, and she'd noticed Jiho immediately. Noticed how he moved with too much awareness, how his eyes tracked things no normal kid would notice, how he sometimes flinched at things that weren't there, or rather, weren't there to normal people's senses. She suspected he was awakened, maybe a late bloomer who'd just recently gained powers and was hiding them. She wanted to approach him about it, to maybe help him, but something told her to wait. That there was more to Jiho's story than a simple awakening. So she watched. and waited, and became his friend, not because of what he might be, but because she genuinely liked him. Liked his quiet intensity, his carefully hidden kindness, the way he saw the world differently than everyone else. The years passed. Jiho turned 12, then 13, 14. With each year, his power grew, and with each year, the secret became harder to keep. His energy was so dense now that awakened individuals could sometimes sense it if they got too close. He had to maintain barriers constantly, had to suppress his aura every moment of every day. It was exhausting, like trying to hold your breath forever. But he did it because the alternative was worse. Dungeons became routine. He'd cleared every rank multiple times over, had faced every common monster and most of the rare ones, had accumulated enough combat experience that he could write his own hunter textbooks. S-rank dungeons, which had once been challenges, were now just time-consuming. He'd enter with Yuna, clear them methodically, collect the magic stones and leave. Sometimes they'd encounter other hunters, and he'd have to put on his scared kid act, pretend to be helpless while actually saving everyone. It had become a game almost. How much could he hide while still accomplishing his goals? But there was a problem. A massive problem that Yuna had seen coming but hadn't known how to address. Jiho was reaching an age where he'd be expected to take the awakening assessment. Every child in Korea was tested at age 15 to see if they had any latent hunter abilities. It was mandatory. There was no way around it. And when Jiho took that assessment, when they measured his power, everything would explode. There would be no hiding anymore. No pretending. The secret would be out. They discussed faking the results. Yuna had contacts who might be able to falsify the data, make it look like Jiho was a weak E rank, or maybe not awakened at all. But Jiho refused. He was tired of hiding, he told her. Tired of pretending to be weak. Tired of watching people struggle with things he could easily solve. He wanted to attend a hunter academy. Wanted to officially become a hunter. Wanted to actually help people instead of sneaking around in the shadows. Yuna tried to explain the consequences. The moment his real power was revealed, his entire life would change. Hunter families would try to recruit him. The government would take interest. He'd lose all privacy, all freedom. But Jiho had made up his mind. And honestly, Yuna understood. He was 15 years old. He'd been living a double life for almost his entire existence. He deserved a chance to just be himself. So they compromised. Jiho would take the assessment, but he'd suppress his power as much as possible. Show enough to get into a good academy, to be taken seriously, but not so much that he'd attract overwhelming attention. They practiced for weeks, finding exactly the right level. Strong enough to be impressive, not strong enough to be terrifying. The day of the assessment arrived. Jiho stood in line with hundreds of other 15-year-olds, all nervous and excited, all wondering if today was the day they'd discover they were special. The testing facility was massive, a complex run by the Hunter Association with state-of-the-art equipment. Gleaming white walls covered in protective runic inscriptions. Security checkpoints at every entrance. This wasn't just a school. It was a fortress designed to contain any awakening gone wrong. Each student would enter a private room, place their hand on a measurement crystal, and wait for the results that would define their future. Jiho watched the other students ahead of him, saw a girl place her hand on the crystal and have it flicker green for a moment before fading. Plant affinity, weak. She left disappointed. Saw a boy make the crystal glow yellow, steady and bright. Enhancement type, maybe C-rank potential. He left grinning. Most kids showed nothing, or maybe a flicker of color. 1 in 50 might light up bright enough to indicate genuine awakening. 1 in 1,000 might show enough power to be classified as B rank or higher right off the bat. His parents were in the waiting area. His mother kept checking her phone nervously. His father sat very still, hands clasped, trying to look calm. They knew what was coming. Knew that the moment Jiho touched that crystal, their quiet life was over. Yuna had offered to be there, but Jiho had told her to stay away. This was already going to cause enough attention. Her presence, a retired hunter with no official connection to their family, would raise questions they didn't need to answer. Jiho's turn came. He entered the room, saw the crystal, the size of a basketball, clear and multifaceted, sitting on a pedestal surrounded by monitoring equipment. The walls were reinforced concrete 3 meters thick. The door behind him was designed to seal automatically if dangerous levels of energy were detected. Standard safety protocols for awakening assessments. The examiner, a bored-looking man in his 30s with graying hair and tired eyes, gestured for Jiho to place his hand on it. Standard procedure. He'd probably processed 50 students already today, probably expected 50 more. Just another day at work. Jiho approached the crystal slowly. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave, to not do this. Once he touched that crystal, once people knew even a fraction of what he could do, nothing would ever be the same. But he'd made his decision. He was tired of hiding. Tired of watching people struggle with problems he could solve. Tired of pretending to be weak when he'd been strong longer than anyone realized. He took a deep breath, placed his hand on the crystal, and immediately had to catch himself because he'd nearly made a terrible mistake. His power, even suppressed, was so vast that the crystal had almost overloaded just from incidental contact. The device started making a high-pitched whine, stress alarms beginning to trigger. He pulled back, created multiple internal barriers, throttled his energy down to what he'd practiced, tried again. The examiner was frowning now, confused by the initial surge, checking his monitoring equipment to see if something had malfunctioned. The crystal lit up. Bright blue, the color indicating magical affinity. The examiner sat up straighter, suddenly interested. Blue was good. Blue meant potential. But then the light intensified, shifted to purple. The examiner's eyes widened. Purple meant strong, really strong. A rank potential at minimum. But it kept going. The purple deepened, darkened, started shifting toward black. The examiner stood up, actually pressed a button on his desk. An emergency alert. Because black meant S-Rank. Black meant someone potentially world-class had just put their hand on his crystal. Jiho panicked slightly. He'd shown too much. Pulled back harder on his power, tried to dim the light. But the crystal was already reacting, and you couldn't take back what you'd revealed. The door burst open. 3 more examiners rushed in, all higher ranked, all staring at the crystal that was now pulsing with dark purple light, teetering on the edge of black. One of them, a woman with gray hair and eyes that had seen too many battles, stepped forward. She looked at Jiho, really looked at him, and her expression shifted from excitement to confusion. Because something was wrong. The crystal was showing immense power, but she could barely sense any energy from the boy at all. Either the crystal was malfunctioning, which was unlikely, or this kid was suppressing his aura better than most S-Rank hunters could manage, at age 15, having just awakened. She asked Jiho to remove his hand. He did, gratefully. The light faded. She examined the crystal, checked its readings, compared them to her own senses, and slowly a smile spread across her face. Not a kind smile, a smile like she'd just found something interesting. She introduced herself as Instructor Mira, Vice Principal of Cheongang Academy, the most prestigious hunter school in Korea, and she was very, very interested in Jiho. The news spread faster than Jiho had expected. By the time he got home, his phone was exploding with messages. Sarah, his friend from middle school, had texted him 7 times, apparently having heard through her family's hunter connections. Yuna called, sounding worried. His parents looked at him with expressions that were equal parts proud and terrified, because everyone now knew. Jiho was awakened. Jiho was powerful. His quiet life was officially over. The recruitment offers started the next day. Every major hunter academy sent letters. Multiple hunter guilds reached out, offering contracts with absurd signing bonuses. Even the government sent an official representative, suggesting that someone with Jiho's potential should consider joining the National Hunter Corps. It was overwhelming. Exactly what Yuna had warned him about. But Jiho had already decided. Cheongang Academy. The most prestigious, most competitive hunter school in Korea. The place that produced more S-rank hunters than any other institution. If he was going to do this, if he was going to officially enter the hunter world, he'd do it at the top. Plus, Instructor Mira had made it very clear that she expected him to choose Cheongang. And something about her intensity, her obvious knowledge that he was hiding more than he'd shown, made him think she might be someone who could actually help him. The entrance ceremony was 3 months away, which meant Jiho had 3 months to figure out exactly how much of his power he was going to reveal. Because that was the real challenge now. He couldn't hide completely anymore. That ship had sailed. But he also couldn't show everything. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He had to find a balance. Had to be strong enough that people took him seriously, but not so strong that he became a national security concern or a target for hostile forces. Yuna helped him develop a strategy. He'd enter the academy as a strong A-rank prospect. Maybe show flashes of S-rank potential occasionally. But he'd claim he was still learning control, still figuring out his abilities. Which wasn't technically a lie. He was still learning, still discovering new things he could do. Just at a level so far beyond academy students that it was almost funny. Sarah got her admission letter too. Her family had always planned for her to attend Cheongang, so them being in the same class wasn't a surprise. But what did surprise Jiho was her reaction when they talked about it. She hugged him, actually hugged him, and whispered that she was glad. Glad he'd finally stopped hiding. She'd known, she admitted, known he was awakened. Hadn't known how powerful, hadn't known about the dungeon diving or anything like that. But she'd sensed something in him. And she was happy he didn't have to pretend anymore. Jiho's last 3 months of normal life were surreal. He still attended middle school, still did homework, and took tests. But now everyone looked at him differently. Teachers who'd barely noticed him suddenly wanted to congratulate him. Students who'd ignored him wanted to be friends. It was fake, all of it, and it made him appreciate Sarah even more. She was the only one who treated him exactly the same as before. He continued dungeon diving with Yuna, but they had to be more careful now. Jiho was on the Hunter Association's radar. They couldn't just show up at random dungeons anymore. So they focused on high-level remote locations, areas that were technically international waters or abandoned zones where monitoring was minimal. Jiho used these last few months to really push himself, to test his limits in ways he'd never quite done before. There was one dungeon in particular, a borderline SS-Rank gate that had appeared on a deserted island off the coast of Korea. The association had left it alone because the cost of clearing it outweighed the value of the magic stones. It would require multiple S-rank hunters and extensive support. Casualties were likely. It wasn't worth it for what would drop. Jiho convinced Yuna to let him try it alone. She was against it at first, terrified that this would be the dungeon that finally pushed him too far. But he'd been holding back for so long. Wanted to know, just once, what it felt like to actually try. To use his full power without worrying about hiding or pretending. She agreed on the condition that she'd monitor from outside and call for help if anything went wrong. The dungeon was a nightmare realm. The moment Jiho stepped through the gate, he felt the difference. This wasn't some structured cave or forest. This was a pocket dimension that actively hated life. The sky was red. The ground was made of bones. The air itself felt hostile, pressing against him, trying to suffocate him, and the monsters were nothing like what he'd faced before. Demons, actual demons, creatures from the deepest floors of hell itself, summoned or created by whatever dark power had formed this dungeon. The first wave attacked within seconds. 7 demons, each one easily A-rank on its own. They came from multiple directions, coordinated, intelligent. Jiho smiled. Finally something that might actually be interesting. He moved through them like water through rocks, fluid and unstoppable. His hands were blurs, each gesture casting a different spell. Fire met, ice met, lightning met pure force magic. The demons didn't stand a chance. They couldn't even touch him. He pushed deeper. More demons, stronger ones, B rank, A rank, some that were probably low S rank. It didn't matter. Jiho was finally letting loose, finally using techniques he'd developed but never had a chance to properly test. He created spell chains, where one magic would feed into another, creating cascading effects. He manipulated space itself, teleporting behind enemies, creating barriers that crushed anything that touched them. He even tried something Yuna had told him was theoretical, pulling energy directly from the dungeon itself and using it as a weapon. It worked. Everything worked, and it was glorious. For the first time in his life, Jiho wasn't holding back, wasn't pretending, wasn't worried about hiding. He was just fighting, using everything he had, everything he could do. The demons fell by the dozens, by the hundreds. He reached the boss room in under an hour, a feat that would have taken a full S-rank team days. The boss was waiting. A demon lord, red skin, massive horns, wings that could blot out the sun, weapons forged from hellfire. It looked at Jiho, this teenage boy who just wiped out its entire army, and laughed. Laughed because what could one human child possibly do against a creature that had destroyed civilizations? It attacked, moving faster than sound. Its blade aimed to bisect Jiho in one strike. Jiho didn't dodge, didn't block. He caught the blade, with one hand. The demon lord's laughter died. Because its weapon, which could cut through steel like paper, which could shatter enchanted armor, couldn't move. Jiho was holding it effortlessly, like it weighed nothing. And then his eyes started glowing. That silver light, but brighter than it had ever been. Bright enough to illuminate the entire boss room. He spoke one word. Enough. And he released it. All of it. Every bit of power he'd been suppressing, controlling, hiding. The demon lord had maybe 2 seconds to register what was happening before it was simply erased, wiped from existence by energy so dense, so overwhelming, that reality itself couldn't handle it. The dungeon started collapsing. Not the normal way dungeons collapsed when cleared. This was different. The entire pocket dimension was breaking down, unable to sustain itself in the face of the power Jiho had just unleashed. He made it out seconds before the gate imploded. Yuna was waiting, looking panicked, having felt the energy surge from outside. She asked if he was okay. Jiho nodded. More than okay. He felt amazing, felt like he could breathe properly for the first time in years. He'd finally let himself actually try. And it had been perfect. But he also realized something. That dungeon, that SS-Rank nightmare realm, had barely pushed him. He'd cleared it in just over an hour. Alone, at 15 years old. And he still hadn't used his full power. Because even at the end, even when he'd stopped actively suppressing, he'd still been holding back. Still keeping the deepest, most dangerous parts of his abilities locked away. Because he wasn't even sure what would happen if he truly let go. The day of the Cheongang Academy entrance ceremony finally arrived. Jiho stood among hundreds of other first-year students, all wearing the academy's uniform, black with silver trim. Most of them looked nervous. Some looked confident. A few looked arrogant, students from major hunter families who'd been training their entire lives for this moment. They had no idea. None of them had any idea who was standing among them. Sarah found him in the crowd. She looked excited, genuinely happy to be there. She'd been forced to attend regular school for years, pretending to be normal despite being from a hunter family. This was her chance to finally be herself. Jiho understood that feeling more than she realized. The headmaster gave a speech, something about honor and duty and the responsibilities of hunters. Jiho tuned most of it out. He'd heard variations of this speech in his head 1,000 times. What actually interested him was instructor Mira. She stood off to the side, her eyes scanning the crowd of new students. And when her gaze landed on Jiho, she smiled. That same unsettling smile from the assessment, like she knew something no one else did. The first week at the academy was orientation. They assessed students' abilities more thoroughly than the initial awakening test, measured their power levels, determined what classes they'd need, where they'd be placed in the ranking system. Cheongang Academy was notorious for its competitive environment. Students were ranked constantly, evaluated on everything from their power level to their combat skills to their academic performance. The top-ranked students got the best resources, the best training opportunities, the most attention from famous instructors. Jiho placed in A rank. Top 10% of his class, impressive for a new awakened student, but not earth-shattering. Not enough to attract too much attention. Exactly what he'd aimed for. Sarah placed slightly lower, B+ rank, which frustrated her. She'd been training since 13 and expected to rank higher. What she didn't know was that most of the Academy's ranking system was based on power output in controlled situations. And Sarah had been trained by her family to be efficient, not flashy. She was probably stronger than her ranking suggested. Classes started properly in the second week. Combat training, magical theory, monster biology, dungeon strategies, all the standard hunter curriculum. For most students, this was their first real exposure to professional hunter knowledge. For Jiho, it was review. He'd read all these textbooks years ago with Yuna, had practical experience far beyond what was being taught. But he played along, took notes, pretended to learn. Only occasionally, very occasionally, would he demonstrate understanding that seemed slightly too advanced, just enough to maintain his reputation as talented, but not enough to raise serious questions. There was one class that actually interested him, though. Advanced Magical Theory, taught by instructor Mira herself. This wasn't standard curriculum. It was an elective for high-ranking students, typically only second years and above. But Mira had specifically invited certain first years, including Jiho and Sarah. The class only had 12 students total. On the first day, Mira explained the premise. Standard hunter education taught you how to use your abilities, how to cast spells, how to enhance your body, how to do the things you'd been awakened to do. This class was different. This class taught theory, the underlying principles of what magic actually was, how it worked, why it worked, and more importantly, how to push beyond your natural limits. She demonstrated by creating a simple fireball. Every student in the room could do that much. Then she modified it. Changed the fire's color, its temperature, its behavior. Made it split into multiple smaller flames, made it burn underwater, made it freeze things instead of burn them. All modifications that shouldn't be possible with basic fire magic. But they were possible if you understood the theory. If you knew what you were actually doing instead of just following instinct. Jiho was fascinated. He'd developed most of his advanced techniques through trial and error, through experimentation in dungeons. But Mira was teaching the science behind it, the mathematical formulas that governed magic, the ways to manipulate mana flow for specific effects. It was brilliant, and it gave him ideas. So many ideas for new things he could try. The first month passed. Jiho settled into a routine. Attend classes, mostly bored but occasionally learning something useful. Train in the academy's practice facilities, always careful to suppress his power. Hang out with Sarah and the few other students who seemed genuinely nice rather than just ambitious. It was almost normal, almost peaceful. But of course, it couldn't last. Because Cheongang Academy didn't just do classroom learning. They did practical exercises, real dungeon dives, starting small, with E-rank gates for first years to practice on. The academy would rent dungeons, verify they were safe, and send students in supervised groups to gain experience. It was completely controlled, completely safe, absolutely no risk of actual danger. Jiho's first academy dungeon dive was scheduled for week 5. He'd be going in with 4 other A-rank students, including Sarah. Their supervisor was a B-rank instructor named Kang, a former professional hunter who'd retired to teaching after an injury. The dungeon was E-rank. Standard goblin cave. Should take about 45 minutes to clear. Should be trivial for a group of talented first years. They entered through the gate. The familiar cave environment. The smell of damp stone. The distant sounds of monsters. Jiho had been in hundreds of dungeons, but this was different. Because this time, he was surrounded by people who didn't know what he could do. People who thought this was actually challenging. He had to match their pace. Had to let them struggle a bit, make mistakes, learn from them. Had to pretend this was difficult. The first goblin encounter went fine. Well, fine for the other students. They fought nervously, wasting energy on inefficient movements, casting spells with too much power or too little control. They won, obviously. E-rank goblins weren't a real threat to A-rank students, but it took them nearly 5 minutes to defeat 3 goblins. Jiho could have done it in seconds. But he hung back, only helping when someone got in trouble, making his intervention look less skilled than it actually was. Sarah noticed, though. He saw her watching him during the fights, saw the calculating look in her eyes. She'd known him for years, had seen how he moved, how aware he always seemed. Now she was seeing him in actual combat, and something wasn't adding up. He was holding back, she was sure of it. But how much? And why? They cleared the dungeon eventually. 42 minutes. Instructor Kang was pleased. Good time for first years. No injuries. Everyone had participated. Everyone had learned something. Except Jiho, who'd learned nothing except how hard it was to pretend to struggle with things that were pathetically easy. More dungeons followed. 1 every 2 weeks. D rank, C rank. Each time, Jiho had to carefully calibrate his performance, show competence, show growth. But not too much. Never reveal that he was honestly more bored than a professional hunter would be teaching kindergartners. But then came the ranking tournament. Every semester, Cheongang Academy held a massive competition. All students would fight in one-on-one matches. Winners advanced. Losers dropped out. It continued until only 1 student per year level remained. The tournament didn't just determine bragging rights. It determined class rankings, training privileges, scholarship allocations, recommendations for guild recruitment. It was the most important event of the semester. Jiho's first match was against a guy named Taeyang, B rank, fire specialist, confident, probably too confident. The fight took place in one of the academy's arena facilities, designed to withstand high-level magic. Hundreds of students watched from the stands. Instructor Mira and the other teachers observed from a special box, taking notes on every student's performance. The match started. Taeyang immediately went on offense, launching fire attacks rapid fire. Standard strategy for fire users. Overwhelming aggression. Jiho dodged easily, not even using magic, just moving faster than Taeyang could track. He could end this in 1 hit. Could do it in a way that would look cool and impressive. But he needed to make it look like a struggle, like he'd earned the victory through superior tactics rather than overwhelming power. So he fought defensively. Let Taeyang get some hits in, though he shielded them so they didn't actually hurt. made it look like he was gradually figuring out his opponent's patterns. Let the fight drag on for nearly 2 minutes, an eternity by real hunter standards, but appropriately dramatic for a student match. And then he countered with a water spell, using Taeyang's fire against him by creating steam that obscured vision, followed by an ice attack that caught the fire user off guard. Victory. Clean but not too easy. Sarah won her match too, and the other A-rank students. The tournament progressed. Jiho won his second match, his third, made each one look appropriately difficult. But by the fourth round, by the quarterfinals, things got interesting, because his opponent was a third year. A guy named Jinseo who'd been ranked in the top 5 of his entire year. A legitimate S-rank prospect who'd already received pre-recruitment offers from major guilds. Jinseo looked at Jiho with barely concealed contempt. A first year. Didn't matter that he was A-rank. Didn't matter that he'd made it this far. He was still just a first year. Jinseo would crush him, make an example, show everyone why experience mattered more than raw talent. The match started. Jinseo opened with an advanced technique, something called Lightning Blade, a combination of enhancement magic and elemental manipulation that was supposed to be third-year curriculum. It was fast, really fast. Fast enough that most students couldn't even see the attack coming. Jiho saw it perfectly, saw every detail, and made a split-second decision. He could dodge this easily, could probably counter it. But if he did, he'd reveal too much. So instead, he took the hit. Let the lightning blade slam into his hastily erected barrier. The barrier held barely, and the impact sent Jiho sliding back several meters. The crowd gasped. Instructor Mira leaned forward in her seat, eyes narrowed. Jinseo grinned, pressed his advantage, launched another attack, then another. Jiho defended, but just barely, making each block look desperate, each dodge look lucky. The crowd was getting into it, cheering for the underdog first year who was somehow holding his own against a top-ranked third year. But really, Jiho was analyzing, studying. Jinseo was strong, no question, but he had patterns, habits, openings that a more experienced fighter would never leave exposed. 3 minutes into the match, Jiho finally went on offense, but not with overwhelming power, with precision. With techniques he'd learned from Mira's class, theoretical applications that he'd modified and perfected. He cast a basic earth spell, just making the ground under Jinseo's feet slightly unstable. The third year stumbled, just barely, just for a fraction of a second. And in that moment, Jiho hit him with 3 simultaneous attacks from different angles, using tricks that shouldn't work, but did because he understood the theory behind why they shouldn't work, and exploited that understanding. Jinseo went down. Hard. The match was over. The crowd went absolutely insane. A first year had just defeated a top 5 third year. It was unprecedented, legendary, the kind of thing that would be talked about for years. Jiho stood in the arena, breathing hard, pretending to be exhausted, while internally he was thinking about how he could have ended that fight in 30 seconds if he'd actually tried. Instructor Mira was smiling that smile again, the smile that said she knew he'd been holding back, knew there was more. She approached him after the match, ostensibly to congratulate him. But what she actually said, quietly enough that no one else could hear, was that she'd be very interested in seeing what he could really do someday. Not as a threat, as an invitation. The tournament continued. Jiho made it to the finals. So did Sarah, surprisingly. She'd been underestimated because of her lower rank. But she fought smart, exploiting her opponent's weaknesses rather than relying on brute force. Their final match would be the most anticipated fight of the entire tournament. 2 first years who'd somehow made it past all the second and third year students. Everyone wanted to see who would win. But the night before the finals, something happened. An emergency alert. A gate had opened in Seoul. Not a normal gate. A catastrophic anomaly. The kind that maybe appeared once every 10 years. SS-Rank. Possibly SSS-Rank. The Hunter Association was mobilizing every available S-Rank hunter in the country. They were evacuating a 10-kilometer radius, and they were asking Cheongang Academy to prepare all high-ranking students for potential emergency deployment. The tournament was postponed. Everyone was put on standby. Jiho watched the news feeds with growing concern. The gate was massive, visible from space. The energy readings were off the charts. And the monsters that had started emerging were things that belonged in nightmares. Greater demons, ancient dragons, undead lords, things that individual hunters couldn't face alone, that required full teams of S-ranks working in perfect coordination. And even then, they were losing. The casualty reports were climbing. 3 S-rank hunters confirmed dead. 7 more critically injured. The line was collapsing. Seoul was about to be overrun by monsters that could level the entire city. The government was discussing nuclear options. It was that bad. Jiho made a decision. He looked at Yuna, who'd come to the academy when the emergency was declared. Looked at his parents, who'd called begging him to stay safe. Looked at Sarah, who was preparing to deploy with the other students, even though they all knew it was probably a suicide mission. And he decided. No more hiding. Not for this. Not when millions of lives were at stake. He went to Instructor Mira's office. She was there, organizing deployment schedules, looking more stressed than he'd ever seen her. He told her he needed to go to Seoul, to the gate. She started to refuse, to explain that first years weren't being deployed, that even the third years were only being sent as support for established teams. But then she looked at him. Really looked. And she saw something in his eyes that made her pause. She asked him a question. Just one question. How strong are you really? And for the first time since his awakening assessment, Jiho told the truth. He didn't know, he admitted. He'd never actually pushed himself to the limit. But he knew he could help. Knew he could make a difference. Knew that people were dying who didn't have to die. Mira was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something that would probably cost her her job. She wrote him a deployment authorization, stamped it with her personal seal, and told him that if he was lying, if he went to Seoul and died because he'd overestimated his abilities, she'd find a way to kill him again herself. But if he was telling the truth, if he really was that strong, then he better damn well come back alive so she could train him properly. The helicopter ride to Seoul took 20 minutes. Jiho could see the gate from miles away, a tear in reality itself, pulsing with dark energy. He could feel the power emanating from it, could sense the monsters pouring through. And he could feel something else. Fear, from the soldiers manning the barricades, from the hunters fighting desperate holding actions, from the millions of civilians who hadn't been able to evacuate in time. He landed at the command post, showed his authorization. The commanding officer looked at him, saw a teenage kid in an academy uniform, and started to object. Started to say that this was no place for students, that they were barely holding as it was, that sending a first year would be murder. But Mira had apparently called ahead, given them some warning. The commander's expression shifted from dismissive to wary. He asked Jiho one question. What rank? And Jiho gave the same answer he'd given Mira. I don't know. They assigned him to a team. 5 S-rank hunters, all veterans, all professionals who'd been fighting high-level gates for years. They looked at Jiho with expressions ranging from confusion to anger. They didn't have time for this. Didn't have time to babysit some academy kid who'd somehow gotten deployed. But orders were orders. They'd keep him alive if they could and focus on the actual fighting. They entered the gate. And immediately, Jiho's world changed. Because this wasn't like any dungeon he'd ever seen. This was chaos. Pure, unfiltered chaos. Monsters everywhere. Greater demons, each one capable of killing professional hunters. Dragons, their scales reflecting magic like mirrors. Undead armies that reformed as fast as they were destroyed. The sky was literally on fire. The ground was literally made of screaming souls. The S-Rank hunters with Jiho started their assault. They were incredible. Truly incredible. Coordinated attacks. Perfect timing. Techniques that would make Academy instructors weep with envy. They killed a greater demon in seconds. Then another. Then 3 at once. But it didn't matter. For every monster they killed, 5 more emerged from the gate. They were being overrun. One of the hunters, a woman named Hyejin who specialized in ice magic, took a dragon's claw to her side. Her barrier shattered. The wound was fatal. She started to fall. And Jiho moved, without thinking, without planning, without holding back. He was there, between Hyejin and the dragon, before anyone even saw him move. His hand was raised, and the dragon, a creature that had been terrorizing Seoul for the past hour, that had killed 3 hunters and wounded a dozen more, just stopped. Stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped existing. Jiho had hit it with enough force to completely pulverize it at a cellular level. There was no corpse, no magic stone, just empty air where an ancient dragon had been a moment before. The other hunters stared. Hyejin, her fatal wound already knitting closed because Jiho had hit her with a healing spell so powerful and so precisely controlled that it had saved her life in seconds, stared. And then the entire battlefield went quiet. Because every monster, every demon and dragon and undead creature had stopped attacking. They were all looking at one thing. At Jiho. At the energy that was radiating from him. At the power he'd just displayed. And for the first time since the gate opened, the monsters looked afraid. Jiho realized what had happened. He'd lost control. Not of his power, he had perfect control of that, but of his suppression, of his hiding. In the heat of the moment, saving Hyejin, he'd let go. And now everything with magical senses in a 5-kilometer radius knew exactly what he was. Knew that something far more dangerous than any of them was standing in this hellscape. He looked at the S-Rank hunters, at Hyejin, who he'd saved, at the others, who were staring at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Fear, awe, confusion. He tried to explain. Tried to say he was sorry for hiding, that he'd had his reasons, that he could explain everything later. But one of them, a grizzled veteran named Do-hyun, who'd been hunting for 30 years, just laughed. Laughed and said they could discuss it later. Right now, they had a catastrophe to stop. And if Jiho was as strong as that display suggested, they might actually have a chance. What followed was the kind of battle that would be studied in hunter academies for generations. Jiho, no longer holding back, no longer pretending, cut through the monster army like it wasn't even there. He moved faster than most of the S-Rank hunters could track. His spells hit with precision that shouldn't be physically possible. He killed greater demons with the same ease he'd once killed E-rank goblins. He fought 3 ancient dragons simultaneously, and won in under a minute. But the real shock came when he reached the gate itself. The source of all this chaos. Gates weren't supposed to be closable. Once opened, they stayed open until the dungeon on the other side was cleared. It was one of the fundamental rules of the dungeon phenomenon. Except Jiho didn't care about rules. He put his hand on the gate, flooded it with his own energy, and forcibly sealed it. Closed an SS-Rank catastrophic gate through nothing but raw power and understanding of magical theory that even experts didn't fully grasp. The battle was over. Seoul was saved. The monsters that had already come through were being cleaned up by other hunter teams, and Jiho stood in the center of what had been a battlefield, surrounded by S-Rank hunters who were looking at him like he was some kind of myth made flesh. Because he was. Because they'd just witnessed a 15-year-old academy student do things that shouldn't be possible. That couldn't be possible. The aftermath was complicated. Jiho became instantly famous. Videos of the battle had been captured, His face was everywhere. The mysterious first year from Cheongang Academy who'd saved Seoul, who'd fought like an SS-Rank hunter despite supposedly being a new awakened student. The questions were endless. How was he so strong? Where had he trained? What was his real rank? Did the government know about him? Did anyone know about him? His interview with the Hunter Association took 8 hours. They wanted to know everything. His background, his training, his abilities. Jiho told them most of it. About awakening as an infant. About training in secret with Yuna. About the dungeons he'd cleared over the years. He left out some details. Didn't mention exactly how many dungeons he'd soloed, or exactly how high rank he'd gone. But he told them enough. Enough that they understood this wasn't some fluke. This was real. He was legitimately this powerful. The association reclassified him officially. SSS-Rank. The first student in Academy history to receive such a rating. The first person under 20 to ever be classified that high. They offered him everything. A position in the National Corps. Endorsement deals. Scholarships. Guild contracts. Everything that hunters dreamed of. He turned it all down. Said he wanted to finish school. Wanted to actually learn instead of just fighting. Wanted to be a student for a little while before becoming a weapon. Cheongang Academy welcomed him back with mixed reactions. Some students were in awe. Some were jealous. Some were terrified. Instructor Mira just smiled and said she'd told him she wanted to see what he could really do. Now she knew. Now everyone knew. And the training could finally begin properly. Sarah hugged him when he got back to campus, punched his arm, told him he was an idiot for hiding for so long, but that she understood. She'd figured it out, she admitted. Figured out that he was hiding something major. She'd even considered confronting him about it before the Seoul incident. Now she didn't need to. Now everyone knew. And honestly, she was relieved. Relieved that her best friend didn't have to pretend anymore. Didn't have to hold back. Could finally just be himself. The tournament finals were rescheduled. Jiho versus Sarah. Everyone expected it to be anticlimactic. After seeing what Jiho could do against SS-Rank threats, what challenge could a fellow first year possibly provide? But Sarah had been training with her family for years. Had techniques that even Jiho hadn't seen. And she'd been studying him. Watching how he fought. Understanding his patterns. The match was closer than anyone expected. Jiho still won, but only after Sarah pushed him harder than he'd been pushed in months. Made him actually think. Actually strategize. It was refreshing. Life at the academy changed after that. Jiho was no longer just another A-rank student. He was SSS-Rank. The strongest person in the school, probably the strongest student anywhere in the world. Classes became less about learning and more about developing. Instructor Mira took him on as a personal apprentice, working with him on advanced theories that even most professional hunters didn't understand. They experimented with magic in ways that technically violated safety regulations, but pushed boundaries that needed to be pushed. Yuna visited regularly. Relieved, honestly. Relieved that the secret was out, that she didn't have to help Jiho hide anymore. Proud of what he'd become. Amazed that the baby she'd started training 11 years ago had turned into the strongest hunter in Korea. His parents adjusted to having a famous son. To reporters camping outside their house. To the knowledge that their child, their little Jiho, was powerful enough to fight national disasters. But despite everything, despite the fame and the classification, and the knowledge that everyone knew his secret now, Jiho's life wasn't that different. He still attended classes. Still trained, still hung out with Sarah and the few friends who'd stuck by him through the chaos. Still went on supervised dungeon dives with his classmates, though now he was typically the one supervising. He'd lost the hiding, the pretending, the constant suppression of his power. But he'd gained something better. Freedom. The freedom to be himself. To use his abilities to help people. to not have to watch from the shadows while others struggled with things he could easily fix. There were still challenges. Other countries wanted to know more about him, wanted to recruit him or study him, or in some cases, neutralize him. The Chinese Hunter Association sent multiple envoys. The American Guild Federation offered him obscene amounts of money. Even the United Nations got involved, suggesting that someone with his power level had responsibilities beyond one nation. Jiho ignored them all. He was Korean. He'd stay Korean. And he'd use his power to protect his country and his people. New gates kept opening. They always did. Some small, some large. A few that required his intervention. He went when he was needed, fought when he had to, saved lives whenever possible. He was only 15. Only a first-year academy student. But he was also SSS-Rank. Also the person who'd saved Seoul from catastrophe. Also someone who'd been clearing dungeons since before he could walk. The weight of that was enormous. But he carried it. Because someone had to. Because he could. Because that's what power meant to him. Not strength for strength's sake, but the ability to protect, to help, to make a difference. Looking back now, Jiho sometimes wondered what his life would have been like if he'd never awakened. If he'd just been a normal kid, normal school, normal friends, normal problems. But then he'd remember the people he'd saved, the disasters he'd prevented, the countless lives that continued because he'd been there, because he'd been strong enough to make a difference, and he wouldn't change it, wouldn't trade it. This was his life, his power, his responsibility, and he'd embrace it fully. The academy year continued. More classes, more training, more dungeons. But now everything was different. Now when Jiho entered a practice arena, everyone watched. When he demonstrated a technique, everyone tried to learn it. When he spoke about strategy or combat theory, everyone listened. He'd become a de facto leader, not because he wanted the role, but because it had fallen on him. Because when you're the strongest, people look to you whether you want them to or not. Instructor Mira pushed him harder than ever. Introduced him to concepts that even she didn't fully understand. They experimented with dimensional magic, trying to understand how gates worked, how dungeons formed, whether it was possible to predict or prevent them. They explored the limits of healing magic, discovering that Jiho could heal injuries that were traditionally considered fatal. They tested combat applications of theoretical magic that had never been successfully implemented. Every experiment, every training session, pushed boundaries, expanded what was considered possible. And through it all, Jiho kept the promise he'd made to himself years ago. He'd use his power responsibly. He wouldn't become arrogant or reckless. Wouldn't let the fame or the strength change who he was at his core. He was just Jiho, a kid who'd been awakened since birth, who'd spent his entire life learning to control impossible power, who'd hidden for years and was now finally free, who'd fight to protect anyone who needed protecting, who'd never stop training, never stop learning, never stop trying to be better. Because that was the thing about power. It wasn't about having it. It was about what you did with it. And Jiho had decided long ago that he'd use his power to help people. All people. Whether they knew it or not. Whether they appreciated it or not. Because that's what heroes did. And even though he'd never asked to be a hero, even though he'd just wanted a normal life, that's what he'd become. The strongest hunter of his generation. The child who'd been clearing dungeons since he was a toddler. The one who'd saved Seoul from catastrophe. The SSS-Rank first year who was already legend. His story was far from over. Gates would keep opening. Monsters would keep threatening. And Jiho would keep fighting. Keep growing. Keep discovering new limits to push past. The world didn't know it yet. But they were witnessing the beginning of a new era. An era where the impossible became possible. where a boy who shouldn't exist changed everything anyone thought they knew about hunters and power and what humans could achieve. Where someone who'd been strong since birth proved that strength meant nothing without the will to use it wisely. The future was uncertain, dangerous, full of threats that even Jiho might not be able to handle alone. But he wouldn't be alone. He had Sarah, had Yuna, had his family, had instructor Mira and the other hunters who'd seen what he could do and chosen to support him rather than fear him. Had a whole academy of students who looked up to him, who wanted to learn from him, who believed in him. And most importantly, he had himself, his experiences, his training, his understanding of what power truly meant. Every dungeon he'd cleared as a child, every secret training session, every moment he'd had to hold back and hide. All of it had prepared him for this, for a life where he wouldn't have to hide anymore, where he could be strong openly, where he could help people on a scale he'd only dreamed about. So when the next emergency came, and it would come, Jiho would be ready. When the next impossible gate opened, when the next unstoppable monster appeared, when the next catastrophe threatened his city or his country or his world, he'd step forward. He'd fight. He'd win. Not because he was SSS-Rank. Not because he'd been awakened since birth. Not because he'd cleared dungeons since before he could walk. But because that's who he was. That's who he'd chosen to be. The person who'd stand between humanity and disaster. The person who'd sacrifice his own anonymity, his own peace for the sake of protecting others. His classmates were still looking up to him, still watching, still learning. And Jiho would continue to teach them. Not just about magic or combat or how to clear dungeons, but about responsibility, about duty, about using your strength to protect the weak rather than dominate them, about being someone worth following rather than someone to be feared, about being a hunter in the truest sense, not just someone who killed monsters, but someone who protected people, someone who made the world a little bit safer, a little bit better, one dungeon at a time. The path ahead was long, uncertain, dangerous beyond measure. But Jiho had been preparing for it since he was 6 months old, since the day he'd accidentally killed an orc trying to attack his family, since the first time he'd entered a dungeon, since he'd made the decision to train in secret, to grow strong in the shadows, to be ready for the day when the world would need him. That day had come, and he'd proven he was ready, proven he could handle it, proven that all those years of hiding and training and preparing hadn't been wasted. So if you're wondering what became of the boy who cleared dungeons since he was a toddler, the answer is simple. He became exactly what he needed to be. A protector, a guardian, a weapon against the darkness. And someday, when the history books are written, when people look back on this era of hunters and gates and impossible monsters, his name will be there. Jiho, the child who was born awakened, who trained in secret for years, who saved Seoul from catastrophe, who became the strongest hunter of his generation, who proved that strength combined with compassion could change the world. And if you enjoyed this story, if you want to see more tales from the world of hunters and gates and impossible powers, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because Jiho's story is just beginning. And there are so many more stories to tell. So many more dungeons to clear. So many more monsters to fight. So many more lives to save. The world of hunters is vast and dangerous and full of wonders, and we've only just scratched the surface. So stay tuned, keep watching, keep believing. Because the next impossible story is just around the corner, and it's going to be even more incredible than this one.